as you all know, today we are joining, Peter Hoffer is joining us, and I'm looking forward very much to hearing what he has to say.
So when you come in, that's the main studio room. Lots of paintings around. And then we go into the big rooms. I often paint. I usually have about 3 or 4 paintings going at the same time. That's where I paint against this room. Here's what the floor looks like. It's pretty good. Every artist has a floor like that. And then it goes off. I've got a garage area where I bring crates in and stuff like that. So a lot of the paintings are here right now because I've got a bunch of crates that just came in. I came back from Berlin. So during this whole crisis thing, I had some paintings that were going off to Paris and to the Berlin gallery. And it was I recalled the crates because these things were sitting in limbo at customs. And so I had to somehow recover these crates. So it is congested in here. And I'm just pulling out all the paintings. So I'm going to pull out some paintings behind me anyways. I've got quite a wide variety of pieces that I've been working on over a long period of time. I do a lot of experimenting still, which is kind of the fun part of painting, making a mess, playing with different resins and materials. And so, when I do something, it often gets shoved away or even lost because it's so messy in here. And then I go back and take a look at the piece later, and some things are obvious what need to be fixed or they're not. I have a hard time throwing stuff away. My friends might say it's a hoarder, but everything is good. It's amazing what you need, and if you throw it away, how much you need it right then. But it's to get set up. What I did do after talking with Carlin was pull out some paintings, and it was kind of neat seeing some works from the past and pulling them out and seeing some of the stuff that I've been working on. I've never felt an urge to stay in a lineage of ideas or a production of any type of paintings. It's probably kind of frowned upon, historically it definitely is, because it's nice to be categorized, and galleries like to have you fit in to a category, and you're expected probably to behave a certain way with your painting, and it has to have a trajectory that's coherent. And I've always had a problem with that. So some of the works, I don't know if Carlin ever had one, she's aware of them. I did these transport truck paintings. I've got some of the fashion pieces behind us, which I started when I was in Berlin. I dabbled in sculptures, drawings, just a whole variety of things. And then I always just kind of return to the landscape. And it's the thing I'm most comfortable with painting and drawing. And it's something that I kind of sort of fell into, career-wise. So, when I came to Montreal, I went to Concordia for the grad program. I was actually in a sculpture program, an experimental sculpture. And that's when I started working with resins and mold making. I was doing a lot of mold making, installation work, sculptures. And I really like working with materials. I always painted, I always drew. That was what I did on my own. But I started looking at the paintings when I was looking at history. Salon school paintings from Paris were starting to interest me, the real thickness of the paints. And reading up on history, I always got a kick out of the idea of the artist being going off to the salons to sell the work. And this is where the vernissage, came into play. The vernissage, which means the varnishing. So they didn't call it the opening, they called it the vernissage. In the opening, they put varnish on their paintings to make the paintings look new, look like they were freshly painted. And if the painting did not sell at the salon, often the artist would roll the paintings back up or cart them up and go off to the next exhibition, in which case they would put a new coat of varnish over top of the painting to make it look like it was new inventory. And I like the idea of perhaps a bad painting, which I was good at doing, having a real thick varnish over it that was accumulative over a period of time, that the varnish itself, the surface of the painting, would be the art, would take on a life aside from the image of the painting. And so I selected landscape for a couple of reasons. One of them is that a landscape is, everyone likes a landscape. If you do a portrait, the portrait is of somebody, and then there's an inherent meaning to that. Landscapes can be neutral, they can be just passive. And so they weren't distracting from the surface. Now I was putting really thick surfaces of Damar varnishes over top of the paintings. They were going up to about an inch thick. Some of the varnishes weren't even setting properly. And then during an exhibition, not a commercial gallery, but during a public show, the varnishes were cracking, going yellow and brown and dripping off the painting. So the idea of the evolving painting was what I was looking at. And the topography of the surface correlating to the topography of the landscape. And so I started working with these thick pieces. It wasn't until I started getting into some of the commercial galleries that they didn't like the idea of, I guess people didn't like the idea of varnishes dripping onto their carpets or something. I don't know. But I switched over to the synthetics, into the epoxies, and started working with the doming of those, which I was aware of from working in sculpture. And so that was 25, 30 years ago, I started working with these pieces. And then I was exaggerating the gloss of the surface. So that got me into heavier into the notion of the image behind the resin, because you can actually see it now. And I started looking at landscape, which I never really, in a museum, I was never really attracted to. But I was looking at them initially to see how the details of the trees or the landscape or the horizons, how they were all set. And I looked into the geometry of the pieces. And I really started getting into it and started looking at these pieces, which I dismissed traditionally as having this great importance. It was a difficult transition, because when you come from the department where you're expected to do more conceptual work, I was up against a lot of opposition at school, especially maybe because I was in the sculpture department and I'm presenting paintings, but also that I was going to something as generic as a landscape. The other thing about landscape, I have to say, which is kind of funny, and it came up quite a bit, when I was in Berlin. And when I was exhibiting some shows in London, I was asked to contribute some pieces. And to their great disappointment, I sent stuff over that wasn't landscape. And they automatically, just assumed, as I'm, part of the colony, that a Canadian artist, that I was going to do landscape or nature painting, an animal or something, because I was Canadian. And it made a lot of sense. Like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So it was a vote of confidence for the landscape. So it's funny, when you're Canadian living in Berlin, you must be a landscape painter. And then my response is, actually, I am. So, I couldn't really defend anything else there. So that brings me into the pieces of landscape. Now, one of the things that I returned to, and I'm going to switch my thing around. Stay with me there. There we are. I'll pull out a couple of paintings. I started doing some tree paintings. Zoom in. So I started doing some paintings I did these before, but I revisited them again when I was in Berlin, of landscapes, and more specifically, trees. So what you're looking at is an oil and acrylic painting of a tree. done in fresco, done with a clay that was found in Italy. And it's the same thing as fresco painting, pretty much. We mix pigments in with this clay substance. And sorry, let me just grab. There we go. Let me put that there. So what I was doing is doing these paintings, and then the surfaces were cracking, and the surfaces would crack somewhat in control. Often I don't have control. And during the exhibition, the temperature of the gallery, or as the resins contracted, the painting would fall apart. So these were environmental pieces, making a statement on environmentalism for this exhibition I was doing, which was the theme. And so the pictures were denigrating. They were falling apart during the course of the exhibition. So this was one that made it to where it was, and the pieces would pile up on the floor. And it's actually the plaster, pulling away from the works. Now, when it got to a certain point, like this one, it's been sealed. There's some sealants you can put over it that stops it from falling apart anymore. Again, commercial galleries have a hard time. I don't know if Carlin wants any pieces that'll fall apart like that. But that's kind of the direction I started going 5 years ago in Berlin, and doing larger paintings. And then I'm going to show you another large one here. So this is I think it must be about 15 feet long, which is why it's in my studio. And that as well, if I can go in and you can see detail, the whole surface is cracked and falling apart, denigrating. I've always been also in my studies, traveling around, going to museums, attracted to some of the more traditional paintings. So getting almost into the history of painting, which I was kind of doing reverse. Usually you do the studies in traditional art, then you make your way into contemporary work and then conceptual art, and then try to be avant-garde. I'm actually working retrograde. I'm going backwards. I lived in New York City for about a while before university, and every day I was going to all the museums, going off to all the artist-run centers, just really indulging in the art scene there. And I always found myself returning to the Metropolitan and going down into the basement of the American wing of painting, and not really interested in the subject matter of a lot of the paintings, in which case a lot of the artists like William Merritt Chase and Singer Sargent, and some of these paintings painted wealthy esteemed members of society. I was really fascinated by the skill of the painting and not as much the subject matter. And I could sit and just look at these pieces for hours. And when I started going to other museums, I remember once I was in Vienna at the Musée in Berlin as well, I was always attracted to pieces that were often anonymous works. And some of these anonymous paintings that were going back, I'd say back to the Renaissance, there was quite a few. But right up until the turn of the century, these gem paintings where they're not attributed to anyone. They know who they're not painted by, but they're not sure who they were. And there's many reasons, there's many theories of where they were, but the value of the painting it became of interest to me. So it was a new direction when I started conceptually thinking about the value of the object. And I have to also confess, and this has nothing to do with the pandemic, but I love watching Antiques Roadshow. And I've loved watching these shows where they go and they look at, people's so-called junk and try and determine what is junk and what's not junk. And when I associate that with the museum, they must go through the same process of what has value, what doesn't have value. Which brings me to the point of paintings or sculptures that are damaged. And you start wondering if the damages are because of a neglect or, other circumstances. Obviously in Europe, you have many different circumstances historically. And so I started looking at the value of the object. And that brings me back to these paintings, which are falling apart, but as they fall apart, they're given more meaning. And I started looking at that type of value in the meaning of the object. And each one, when it comes apart in its own idiosyncratic, unique way. Now, this is a small one I'm holding up. I often did very large paintings. And this is, if you can see, it's the canvas that comes through right to the core, and then there's a plaster and whatnot. And as with the large one I just showed you, cracking like that, it's all painted intentionally with the piece falling apart, but then the resin encapsulates it, almost like well, not almost, but a protective layer. And it seals the piece and gives it, and it commodifies it because it's glossy and it's like a shrink wrapping. And so there is a sense of the piece having a value because it's a painting and it might be well painted or not. And it seems to be protected with a resin, but the piece itself has been denigrated and seems to be falling apart. So the value of the work is where I went with that. And, you know, with the museums discovering pieces that may have been overlooked, that may have been well painted, or paintings that were well-known artists who created them, but were damaged, and what value they have. I hope I don't digress too much, but there was a recent article of an insurance company scandal with the museum, and an artist had a piece, a sculpture. I'm trying to think of who the artist might be. You know, a big name like an Anish Kapoor, and the piece got damaged. It fell apart in transit and it was destroyed. And it was, I don't know, worth $12 million. And the insurance company covered it for the museum. Then the insurance company wanted the broken pieces, the shattered pieces to it. And the museum didn't want to surrender it. But the insurance company says that they now own the damaged artwork. And then it became a problem because does the damaged artwork have a value? Do the pieces, are they like little religious reliquaries? Are they, they must have a value. And the museum got into a legal battle that they would surrender the pieces as long as the museum would completely destroy the art on the request of the artist. So, it was an interesting, play legally, of course. I'm not sure even how it played out. And what interested me was the fact that does the art still have value if it has a chip in it, or if it has something, wrong to it, especially if the meaning of it, is conveyed. And, who better than Duchamp historically to take on these, with his damaged piece that went to museum and his response saying that is what it's supposed to do. So when the piece is out there, it has that life of its own. So, these are things that I thought about with painting the landscape, because the landscape is ever evolving. It's falling apart, it's being added to. And so, doing these pieces with that in mind is the direction I went with, exaggerated more so with these damaged fresco-like paintings. I don't know, I think I could probably I could say as well that I'm interested in about singling out trees versus doing vista landscapes. So I've changed up a bit there. Initially, I was doing the vista landscape because I was looking at the skies abstractly in a painterly way, aesthetics. But I was arranging the landscapes and the trees accordingly, almost like a stage. So I was personifying the trees. So all the trees were arranged in relationship to each other in a composition. And I looked at the paintings as a stage backdrop, and then the foliage as the actors. And that brought me into doing paintings of single trees, where the actual singled out tree is now personified because it becomes portrait-like. And you also have thrown in the question the idea of scale. So despite the painting, the size of the tree, I'll get a small one here. I mean, this is a smaller thing I can hold up. When you see the painting of a tree, you're not sure, is this a tree that is viewed from a massive tree, but the viewer is at a distance looking at it? Or are we really up close to it and it's almost like a shrub? So, when it's a tree, just one tree, when it has resin on, this one does not, it becomes confrontational. You have a relationship between you and the tree as an object and the art piece as an object. And then with the resin on it, I should also say another quality of the resin is the glare, the shine of it, which is seductive and also very reflective. And I did an exhibition, I think one of the first exhibitions I had done of pieces which were abstract. At the museum, I turned the lights that had the gallery against their will, because they pay someone to make sure everything's lit perfectly. I had them reduce the gallery lights and put spots right onto the center of the painting, which created a really awkward glare. And what I liked about it, it wasn't so evident during the opening or the vernissage, but it was evident afterwards when there was just small groups of people viewing the paintings. People would go up and they would be annoyed by the painting, and they'd be looking at the lighting in frustration and getting up close to the paintings and trying to get a better angle and really stretching their vision to see what the image was. And on many occasions they would relent, they would stand back and then admire, you would admire your own reflection into the painting. So you're always reflected in the painting. I had someone putting lipstick on. I had some kids that were, making rabbit ears and whatnot. And so there was an interaction between the art object and the viewer. So there was another quality I wanted to mention about the resins. And with these trees being what I would say confrontational in a nicer way, if there's a nicer word than confrontation, there's a relationship you have with the tree. The tree itself, is looking at you. And I look at trees differently now. I go out in the world, and a lot of people ask if I paint from photographs. I do photograph trees, but I generally don't paint from photographs. I mostly make reference to older paintings, everywhere from the Hudson School. There's many examples. Go back to Claude Lorraine and people like that. I've studied how they've taken trees and landscapes and worked with those. Most of them, few examples, were landscapes as landscape. They actually had a figure in with the trees. Constable was famous for putting figures in the landscapes as well, to give you a sense of the grandiose scale of the landscape. Where I don't put figures in my pieces. The tree themselves, I want them to be the figure, and I don't want to suggest the scale of the tree. So, anyways, I don't know, Carlin. I said a lot. I went on. I didn't see anyone. Is everyone muted me? I can't tell if I've been muted a ways back.
No, we can hear you.
Okay.
And this is really this is great. I'm reminded of was it Graham Cawtrey who famously said, "Every damn tree in Canada has been painted." Was it him that said that?
Graham Cawtrey was my prof at OCA many years ago. One of my favorite profs. He taught me, actually, he was responsible for getting me into the idea of resins. This is back in the 80s, because he was the one who introduced myself to glazing, his glazing technique of mixing in with all sorts of turpentines with some of his varnishes. Oh, I love Graham. Yeah, wonderful guy. Him and Gord Rayner were my profs. Ian Carr Harris and whatnot. Yeah. I don't remember what Graham said about the trees, though. I never heard it. He never told me that one.
When he started doing his nude series, he was asked why he was painting nudes, and his response was that every damn tree in the country had already been painted.
So I have to return to nudes, I guess.
Do you have any examples in your studio there, Peter, that you can show us of the figures that you started putting at the center of paintings that aren't trees? We have a number of them at the gallery right now, where you've got the horse and rider, where you've got the drummer boy, that kind of thing.
All right, I've got one here. I'll turn it around. There might be a bit of glare from the window. If I fall down and hurt myself pulling it out, call 911. You got my address. It'd be funny, actually. It would probably go viral if I wiped out and knocked my head on this platform. Somebody had to call somebody and tell them where I was and if I was okay. All right, swing it back around. Can you see that one very well?
Little out of, yeah, we can.
So this is one that I have here. It is finished. The figure is not put in. It's just left with little details. This is a Prussian Soldier. So this is a piece I done in Berlin, and he's standing on his horse in a garden-like setting, a landscape that is a manicured garden. And I did a few of horse and riders that brings apart the isolation, but it's contemplative isolation is what I was looking at. There's a bit of a melancholy, but they're ghost-like figures. Some of them work better than others when I was doing these. Carlin, you got one. I think you have the drummer boy. But these are characters that are alluding to a history, and they are ghost-like from the past. That almost like a spirit of a landscape that comes out. I did a couple of Mountie ones like that, and there's a lot of things that the piece can represent, especially the Mountie one with with what happened in Nova Scotia with the Mountie being killed. The piece of the lone rider is symbolic in that sense, but even outside of that, it is about a contemplation, a solitude, and the idea of frontier is where I was going with a lot of the horse ones. The Prussian one, obviously, because that's in Berlin, it was a fascinating history there, and it's kind of one of the reasons that brought me to why I was interested in Berlin is the German association with the forest, historically and even culturally, even contemporary. The Germans have a similar, I feel, sense of forest as Canadians do, and the frontier. And so I kind of was attracted to that and started looking at a lot of German landscape painters and look at how they dealt with landscape. And then I was also, also very much attracted to, and I kind of delved in the idea of the garden, of state gardens. I wonder if I have a piece on here. And here's another painting. I don't know if you can get it because it's gloss. Yeah, it's too much gloss, I'm afraid.
The reflection is defeating us, I'm afraid.
Yeah, well, that's what it's supposed to do, Carlin. So anyways, I started working with some manicured.
Peter, a couple of people are asking questions.
Oh, okay. I'll go to my chat.
No, I'll just, well, you can, or I'll tell you what they're asking. People are asking about your daily routine, how you structure your time and how you get yourself into the studio. Do you get stuck for inspiration? Do you take days off? What's your work ethic like, or practice?
It's changed a lot, not because of the pandemic or anything, but it's changed a lot because I've got 3 little boys. I think a single dad with 3 little kids means I'm 1 week on, 1 week off. And so when I have the kids, they're full on. I tried to get them to do some of the resin for me because it was starting to get too toxic for me to do. But it became, children's services got involved in that and they didn't like it. No, I got to keep them busy. So what I've gone is 1 week on and 1 week off. And my week on now, I just got to be motivated and I got to get work done. So the playing part has come to a stop. And I spend a lot of my time, unfortunately, like crating and setting up shop. I was in Berlin for quite some time, and trying to reclaim my studio back here full time was a bit daunting, a bit awkward and clumsy. Like I said, I still have some crates coming in. I still have like piles of crates everywhere. So my routine is not what it used to be. My routine used to be that I would work until 3 a.m, lose track of time. I would start painting around 4 p.m. Because there was way too many interruptions before that. And when I mean interruptions, I mean just returning emails and talking with galleries, picking up supplies and resins. And I tried to have studio assistants. I don't like anyone else around, so it's difficult. So I do it all myself. But I'll go up, 4 p.m, and I could paint solidly till 2, 3 in the morning. A bottle of wine helps. But no, I was very productive. And music is always on. I've got a system everywhere, every room, and it's a welcome distraction. And that's how I used to do it. I've recently set up. I got somebody here. One moment. If anyone wants to come with me to the door, it could be FedEx. Hey, hello. I'm just online. That's it. They're all ready to go. 2 pieces.
Less than $2,000.
It's less, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. All right. Hey, painting just went off to Budapest. So sorry. So that's why I didn't start painting until, I think that just answered your question. Living on Saint Laurent, my studio here is all sorts of interruptions. But I've recently started a studio up north. I have a studio on a lake in the Laurentians that I had completed 2 or 3 years ago. And I'm doing a lot of painting up there. I get a lot done. It's feast and famine in terms of production. Inspiration's not a problem. The only problem is I'm inspired to do a lot of things. And I kind of become compulsive and obsessive when I see something that I like in terms of art that I need to, I often try and mimic it. When I go to a museum and I see a painting and I see them and they are so incredibly done that they just jaw drop when I see artists, contemporaries of mine doing work, it kind of threatens me. It challenges me to go back to the studio and try and go to where that bar's been raised. You can solve that problem by not looking at other art. But no, I like to get inspired by seeing other art. But mostly books and music. Now I've been getting into a lot of films, older films, all sorts of films where I'm looking at the cinematography and landscape and how it's presented. And so I go back into the studio. I generally don't do drawings. I look at drawing as a bit of a distraction to the painting because the painting never goes there. And I know how my composition is going to be laid out before I take on the canvas. But I'll just go at it. I always make sure there's tons of paint around, brushes, and I just go down. And I usually don't stop, give or take when they're larger paintings, until the piece is finished. I'm easily distracted, so I have to really get through to the end. It can be a very frustrating process to work that way. But that's generally the process I do. Of course, when I go up to the north, up to the lake, it's usually in the summertime. I'll work outside. I have a boathouse studio where I leave the doors open. But it's just like any other job. I try to get full hours in. But there are days where stuff just doesn't come together and you just have to walk away. Or there's some days where, there's just too many distractions. So that's basically, the process is a bit of a workaholic, less so now in terms of the paintings. But I don't take it for granted, this profession. I'm very fortunate that, I have galleries like Oeno Gallery, and I've been through many galleries over the years, and I've been very fortunate. They've been selling a lot of the pieces, and it's a great job to have. So I don't complain whatsoever. And I like doing what I'm doing. I'm actually surprised at the reception the pieces received, because I don't look at any strategy when I do paintings. There's no strategy involved. I have an idea and I go right to the canvas, and sometimes it's a waste of paint. Sometimes I can reuse the canvas, and many times I can't. Especially when you start working with the resins and varnishes, they're very expensive varnishes. And if you make a mistake, it's done, and it happens. One of the difficulties transitioning to the galleries with some of these resins, which is a different process, because that's, you got to clean the space up, and I work with a respirator and a suit and all this stuff. But the resins, you know, I initially wanted them to change, go yellow, go amber. I would mix pigments in with the resin. I don't like perfect surfaces. I don't like the plasticity of it. So I would give a topography to the surface of the paintings. And I was okay for a few years with those, with galleries. But then when resin started being poured on everything, my paintings were often looked upon as bad surfaces, because they were discoloring and changing shape, and the surfaces weren't perfectly smooth. And I've kind of resisted. I've done some pieces with a nicer surface. I don't like it. I'm a messy person by nature, and and I think that's natural. I'm not making an excuse. I like the immediacy of the paint. I would love to be an abstract expressionist if I could pull it off. It looks like a lot of fun, and it is a lot of fun. And I would be closest to my middle child, who loves the texture of the paint. And when I see paintings on gallery walls, and these thick, luscious paint dripping off, I like that. I'm not very good at that, but I'm good at making a mess. So I should throw in there that I do like making a mess as part of my a process, unapologetically. That answer?
I've got a great answer, because it's very interesting to me, having watched your work evolve over many years. For example, now that you've started introducing a lot of collaging elements, historical references, wallpapers, objects, newspapers, ripped and torn, piled up on the surface of your paintings and then painted upon them, they've taken on a whole different sculptural quality, there is a kind of a beautiful, it's interesting. It's like the model paintings, where there is this beautiful objectified figure, but then you've done a lot of different layering of other graffiti-like elements or tougher elements interspersed with those central objects of beauty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so those pieces came out of being when I was in Berlin. My studio was in Rummelsburg, which is East Germany, and it would be an hour cycle ride from Kaiserslautern to Rummelsburg to the studio, and I was cycling. If anyone's been to Berlin, it's a very flat, great bicycle path. And I would go through Kreuzberg, and you know, I went through Neukölln, and I went through all these different areas that you know, are in the natural gentrification or unnatural gentrification process, but they were very distinct neighborhoods, especially, you know, before the wall. And it's taken some time for these places to reclaim, and each neighborhood has a certain quality to it, which is really interesting. The one common denominator, again, if anyone's been to Berlin, is its advertising. These posters, these bills, plastered everywhere. It's, you know, the graffiti is everywhere. Every inch of surface that's flat has a poster and advertisement on it. Very large posters, billboards. And so there was a continuity between, you know, traveling across these different areas to my studio, which was an industrial area where the studio was in East Germany. So I started, you know, on my periphery, is what I was picking up on. And so every day when I back and forth, I was coming across lots of fashion imagery, and lots of concerts. Berlin famous for concerts and exhibitions, rock shows, nightclub events, and they were appealing to me. Just the tactility of the posters. So over a period of time, and it doesn't take long, but the posters would pile up. They would re-glue another one over top, and the posters they'd get up to an inch thick of paper before they would just curl and fall off the wall. And in between each layer, you've also got lots of graffiti going up. So as objects, they were beautiful objects. But I started again, going into the idea of the image and the meaning of the image and what is advertising, and then how it's been hijacked by this most of the time completely objective or incidental intervention of a spray can, which has nothing to do with the image. Sometimes it did. It might be a reaction to the image, but most of the things were not controversial enough to demand such a response. So you had these haphazard periphery actions that I was seeing, which I really liked. And I'm going to take you. I hope this shows up. I'll have to turn a light on. Unfortunately, this is the place where I shoved all the garbage when I cleaned up my studio. So I'll see if I can undo it. I'll turn a light on. So in the back of the studio, I did this massive piece. If anyone can see it. All right. And I'm not sure if I might be able to bring it up. So that's a very large a paper piece that's been. I have it in the garage up in the wall because I'm trying to unroll it. It came back from Berlin rolled up tight, and so it's paper, and it's paper is made up of torn posters that have come off that I found on the street, and some paper I've had in the studio, and it's done in the same manner as some of these fashion pieces here, which are very detailed paintings. Very detailed oil paintings. And then, yes, Carmen was right. It's got like antique wallpaper, all sorts of ephemera, newspaper clippings, and what have you in there. And these were taken from the idea from fashion shows, different events going on, not with the text. And this one you can see that all the antique wallpapers, which are thrown over the piece in a collage. And then the large one back here, which is a Versace one. It's got all the posters. You can kind of see that they are posters. That one there might have Ospenhoff. So you can. It's very tactile. The pieces are very. Very thick. And so and a lot of the posters advertising nightclubs and various other types of clubs. And then I would arrange them. I mean, it was an aesthetic judgment how I put them together. So the David Bowie piece. So there is a piece, and if anyone knows, it didn't really have too much to do with David Bowie, although now it does. But he's a god in Berlin, as we know. And when he was releasing his last album, which became his last album, the advertisement for it was a big massive white blank sheet with a black star. And then underneath it was David Bowie, and then the date of the album release. And that was it. It was a minimal poster. Because he is of such a godlike status in Berlin, that's where he lived for a short period of time, did some important work, he was untouchable. So his posters never got graffitied. Everything around it did. So there was about 3 of them on my bike ride to Rummelsburg. These massive posters, and everyone wanted them, but they're glued on well. You can't take them down. And the graffiti and the destruction was all around, but never his pieces. And so I would see these posters be, like I said, about 3 large ones on the way to my studio, and then eventually a new poster will go up, and then the destruction begins. I really liked the minimal aspect of the image, this white black minimal star. And so I had that painting that I have is actually a billboard size to the exact dimensions of the advertisement David Bowie did, except I took all the surrounding posters and graffiti and put it all into the minimal to make it, an expressionist-like poster, the exact reversal. The star, the text of David Bowie and the date are carved out with a knife, so that it was actually, it carved through the other layers underneath, revealing the different layers, and that's what would spell out the name. And then I had the piece put up outside of my Berlin studio, which was, on a heavily trafficked area, and there was even a nightclub rave place next door. It didn't take long for it to get graffitied, and then I removed the piece, and that was the piece. I was going to exhibit it, and then David Bowie died shortly thereafter. So now the piece has become, with the date, it was like a memorial. So I didn't exhibit it in the show that I had in Berlin because I didn't want it to be, not out of disrespect, but it wasn't meant to be a memorial piece. It wasn't meant to be a piece other than an art object, and David Bowie happened to be on it. And so the piece never got exhibited. So the fact that it has a date on it, which was the album release date, that almost looks like a headstone date, gave it a meaning, and bringing it back with me has now kind of become a piece that I like to keep as memento of a place and time. And that's what I liked about the pieces with the posters, as with the fashion ones, that they have a date and time on them that marks a place, and the pieces become historicized immediately as time evolves. Another piece I have, this was when there was the beginning of the mass exodus out of Syria and North Africa, of everyone coming to Germany. Very contentious political, still is, issue in Germany. Angela Merkel was, in the midst of, and it was, I was at the forefront living there. You could see it every day in people's reaction. For the most part, I mean, in Berlin, it was, you started seeing a lot of graffiti saying "refugees welcome," sprayed everywhere. And for me, initially, I thought it was facetious. I thought it was being sarcastic, because, of what I kind of assumed with my skewed beliefs that they would, automatically not be welcoming. But in fact, in Berlin, anyways, in the communities and people I talked to, they were very welcoming. And the refugees welcome was graffitied over top of advertisements that were advertising, and this one behind me, there's posters of erotic nightclubs and these high-end restaurants, and just by being a Gianni Versace advertisement itself, I found it ironic that, a lot of these countries, not all of them, but many of the immigrants coming in, the migrants coming in to Berlin, were quite religious and Muslim, and these are vices. So they're being welcomed by people whose vices are opposing to the values, of what the Islam might say. But I did like that contrast, and so I took some posters down, and with the X-Acto knife carved in the refugees welcome, and the idea of maybe the refugees imposing their own mark onto this culture, and by the knife cutting out the layers are revealing the past, archaeologically, almost literally, the past of previous posters. So I started doing a lot of work like that, and that's where the fashion ones come in. So they've got the highly detailed painted, which I really don't like doing anymore. High detailed paintings take a lot of time, and then with the mess of the posters and the ephemera all thrown over top of it, where by doing the posters, it kind of takes away from the delicate process of the detailed image and the value of something like Versace or Fendi or Chanel or whatever the other ones happen to be. It was a play on that, a little bit of a departure, again, as I said before, from doing landscape.
Peter, it's really terrific to get some insight into all the many political and social things that and art history that has informed your practice. Somebody's been asking a question about whether you are, I think what you've just answered in terms of Are you painting what you see or what you photographed, or are you dissecting it and putting it back together again and recombining it in different ways? And I think you just answered that question quite clearly. You're recombining those elements. I just wonder right at the moment, because we only have a couple minutes left, if people want to turn on their cameras so that we can see everybody. And if anybody else has a question or not that they would like to, a question they'd like to pose to Peter, it'd be nice for him to be able to see who he's been talking to here. And I know that people who've joined these before are getting good at turning their cameras off while you're talking just because of the bandwidth issues. It makes it a little easier. But this was a terrific presentation, Peter. And I want to thank you very, very much for that. Do you want to does anybody else want to raise their hand and ask another question? We have time for maybe a couple more questions if anybody has them. Or comments you'd like to make about your experience here today? Anyone? Rob Wood, where are you? You're sending a message here? Do you want to turn your mic on? Not sure
Yes, I'm
where
here,
Rob Wood
Carolyn.
is,
I
but-
thought it was a really terrific talk and interesting to see. I've admired Peter's paintings for many times in the gallery, and it's interesting to see the thought process behind it. I found that Peter's working at multiple levels, which is really fascinating to me. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Rob.
It's always interesting as a gallerist to work with an artist who you can't predict what they're going to do next. And Peter is very unpredictable, and it's one of our great delights.
I've been good. I've been
Anyone else?
best behavior here.
Well, that's just been great. So I just want to say, Peter, thank you very much for taking the time to share with us all, and a big internet clap and hug to you. So thanks so much.
Well, thank everyone for listening on this beautiful day to be inside and listen to this talk.